Hi, thank you all for coming. And thank you to Kelly for making this happen and Charlene upstairs. It's always nice to do these things and get to see some family at the same time. I call my lecture Things That Make My Heart Beat Faster. Artistic approaches vary widely, but I think of mine as, at least in part, to be one of discernment, to find the things that excite me visually, emotionally, intellectually, and try to understand why, and then try to bring those things into my work. And in putting the lecture together, I've paired up sort of like things, and it gives the impression, mostly a false impression, that my knowledge of those things happened simultaneously. Often they were separated by many years. So a lot of the pairing, with the exception of the first quarter of the lecture, they were done after the fact. I grew up in what could now be called the Sopranos section of New Jersey, in the New York suburbs, and as a child had no interest in art whatsoever. This is my cousin Gordon with me, 3 and 4. Gordon went on to be national editor of U.S. News and World Report, and his area of expertise was the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. And I went in another direction. I started making jewelry. I met a jeweler when I was ski bumming in Stowe, Vermont, and we got to be friends. And that summer, she started to teach me. And I found a creative side that was completely dormant, that I had no idea was there. I'm going to get rid of this since it's kind of warm in here. And eventually, that led me to the University of Vermont. And I started taking classes in the jewelry studio and practically living in the studio, and then taking all kinds of other art classes and kind of building my skills artistically and technically. Eventually, after about a year working for a very good production jeweler up there, I transferred to Rhode Island School of Design, where I got my BFA in 1982. So this is some early student work, working with alternative materials. This is titanium and silk, and ebony and copper, and layers of woolen fabric. And I was sort of looking at geological formations and the way the highways were cut between Vermont and Rhode Island through the stone, at least for this one. As a student, I got exposed to a book called How to Wrap 5 More Eggs, and it's a book of traditional Japanese wrapping and packaging. And I was very taken with the directness, the sensitivity to materials, the simplicity of the compositions, and I started to try to bring that into my work. At RISD, my professional practices teacher was Dale Chihuly, world-renowned glass artist. And while the class was one of the least organized I've ever taken, it was also one of the most useful and valuable. And Dale basically brought whatever friend of his was in town that week into the class, and they do a talk very much like what I'm doing now, and talk about how they're selling oriental rugs to support their painting. And it gave me some idea of what a life as a professional artist would be, and kind of gave me a bit of a trail of breadcrumbs to follow, and made me feel much more confident in approaching galleries when I got out of school. So here the wrapping ideas are starting to come in. I started looking at pictures of the Zen gardens, and particularly in Kyoto, Japan. And now I'm into my senior year. These are hollow forms in silver and gold. And I started working with slate. I found a piece of slate in Providence, and I was interested in contrasting black and gold, and the slate seemed like a great alternative material to silver. So these are sort of geological in tone. At this point, I got out of school. This is here for good photo, bad photo, for the students here. During that class with Chihuly, he must have said, get great pictures of your work. More people will see your pictures than your actual work. 1,000 times in the course of a semester, and it hit home. Anyway, so at this point I got out of school. I set two primary goals. One, I wanted to make a living at my work, and number two, I wanted to continue the artistic development that I found so satisfying in school. And in order to do the first, I applied to the 3 top craft shows in the country. And to do the second, I sent portfolios to the 3 top galleries in the country. And I was very fortunate. I got into all 3 craft shows, and I was taken on by all 3 galleries within the first year out of school. But before I could do any of that, I decided I needed to do something I hadn't done for 11 years. I needed to get a haircut. So this is maybe 1980, something like that, at Haystack. I kind of kept the hippie thing going longer than most, but anyway. So the first thing that happened was I was in a show at Artware Gallery in New York, which was run by Robert Lee Morris. And I'd sent him a portfolio. A month or 2 later, I got a note scribbled diagonally on a piece of paper, "Mr. Morris would like to see your work, call for an appointment." And I went right down to New York and set that up. And we sat down in the basement of the gallery, and he looked at all my work and divided it into 2 piles. And most of it was in one pile, and the other pile was this necklace and this pair of earrings. And he said, "I have a new artist show opening in a month. I'd like you to do a collection of earrings based on these 2 designs, and maybe I'll put you in the show." Yeah, so a month, yeah. To be at probably the highest visibility jewelry gallery in the United States at the time. And I have no idea where I got the nerve to say this. I said, "A month isn't enough. If I spend time coming back down here to show you the work, that'll take away from the studio time to prepare for the show. I know I can do this. I really want to get a commitment from you now." Like, what the hell was I thinking? And Robert got up from the table and started to leave, and I was all ready to grovel and say, "You're the boss, whatever you want, whatever you want." And he turned over his shoulder and said, "All right, let's do it." So, little chutzpah there. So, needless to say, I, had to put my money where my mouth was. So, over that month, I developed what became the basis of my production line: sterling, selectively gold-plated earrings, and some work with ivory and patinas, working with the wrapping ideas, and that became the basis of the production. The selectively gold plating, I'll get back to later, it became a huge problem, but it worked at least initially. So I did 1 craft show, and I made $600. It was the Smithsonian Craft Show, which is now the top show in the United States. It was my first show ever, and its first show ever in 1983. And people were asking questions like, "Now, is this work for sale?" I mean, it was sort of ground zero of educating an audience. So at the end of the show, one of the veteran artists came over and said, "Kid, you need a low-end item." And so I had this idea for these little pins. They're called clothespins, and a jacket, a vest, and a tie. And I learned about the commercial photo etching process that the jewelry industry uses at a workshop. And I developed metal models and found a manufacturing company in Rhode Island where I was still living, and to do the photo etching. So the etching, you can do a full etch or a half etch. It cuts out the full etch, etches halfway through from each side. It cuts out the shape. A half etch does little score lines and my signature and copyright sign. And I sold thousands of these things. They were $16 to $28 retail. And after a while, there were so many little clothes in my apartment, it looked like some sort of leprechaun rummage sale. It was totally out of control. So there's more design time in my least expensive work than anything else I make. Production to me is sort of the ultimate design challenge. Figuring out a $50 retail earring in silver, that's really, really hard to do anywhere near competently and have it have a personal voice. So my main focus was the one-of-a-kind work. I found a chalkboard, an old blackboard, smashed up, and that became my major art supply for the next about 10 years. I also traveled in the American Southwest and was knocked out by the quality of the landscape and the textures, and particularly the way erosion had sculpted the stone of the landscape. When I got home, I translated those ideas directly into the slate work. I used a sandblaster to literally erode away the stone. And that gave me a whole new range of forms at my disposal. And sometimes they were rough, sometimes they were smooth. The slate had a really nice expressive range. So Noguchi said, I love the use of stone because it's the most flexible and meaning-impregnated material. The whole world is made of stone. It's nothing new. It's as old as the hills. It is our fundament. So I mentioned that the selectively gold plating turned into a nightmare. My plater trashed 40 pairs of earrings right before a major show, and I decided that plating was something I should probably not do. And I won't bore you with the technical side of it, but so I had an idea for a new material that was a lamination of silver and 18-karat gold. And after a fairly long period of searching around, I found somebody in the Providence jewelry industry to manufacture this stuff for me. And it's now sold it's called bimetal. And I thought briefly about trying to copyright it or patent it, and decided that much smarter guys than me had lost a fortune speculating in metals, and that was a bad idea, and I wanted to be an artist. So I threw it open to the field. And so a lot of people work with it, and most of them have no idea where it came from. And it's now commercially available through Hauser & Miller and other places. So anyway, so that gave me color of the gold, but closer to the price of the silver. I started to try to bring open spaces into my work and started viewing the clothing as part of the composition, so you're actually seeing come through a window. Oops, we'll go back. Yeah. So another witticism. In production work, design decisions become lifestyle choices. If you design a line of jewelry that's high polished, you will spend your life polishing. After working for Tim Grannis for a year, I did not want to do that. So what I've always done is kind of knocked off my one-of-a-kind work and used that to develop the production line. In this case, I took a mold off of the slate to get the texture of the stone, developed the model, and then sweat soldered the bimetal section onto it. And these are earrings and cufflinks. My father redecorated his bathroom in New York and had these ceramic tile samples all over the house, and they looked like art supplies to me, so I swiped them. And I did a little bit of work in ceramic tile, still working with a sandblaster. I was actively trying to find a way to bring color into my work, and I had just enough color theory in art school to be completely insecure about my color judgment. It's since gotten much better, but sometimes a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. And so I started to work with semi-precious stone. This is sodalite. I also started to experiment in glass, set in gold. Did some work with agate. And these stones carve beautifully with a sandblaster. Agate is quartz, so basically glass, a form of glass, and it carves really nicely with a sandblaster, much more slowly than the slate, but I was basically teaching myself lapidary work and how to cut stones in different ways. And finding polished slabs of agate, finding an area I liked, cutting it with a diamond saw, and then refining the form. Did a little bit of work with black stripe agate and some diamond inlay. and did some work with a German manufacturing company in the German Gem Center of Eder Oberstein, Germany. And they cut a agate blank for the bracelet, and then I carved it with a sandblaster. This is a piece by Goldsworthy. He wrote a grant proposal, and this is the greatest grant proposal I've ever heard of in my entire life, to do site-specific installation work at the North Pole. How could any arts organization turn this down? I mean, this is just, I mean, leave aside that the work is fantastic and he's an accomplished artist. This is the most brilliant proposal I've ever could conceive of. So I continue to develop production, and that continues, to be a major part of my business. Both earrings and cufflinks. So I had an idea for a new approach to sandblasting, and I didn't want to waste my agate. And I found some glass in a dumpster, and I decided to do some tests on that. And I ended up liking the glass as much or more than I liked the agate. So this is, it's a window glass, thick window glass. It's one piece of glass carved, and it's over a metal called niobium, which is anodized electrically to change its color. And this as well. So here I've masked it out with a piece of steel screen, and I've cut the weave of the screen out in one direction, and it gives it a little bit of a kind of Rothko, at least in my mind, Rothko-like quality. But I did go back to the agate, and I found I was able to really control the sandblasting. I masked this out with a perforated sheet metal, so a piece of steel with all these hole patterns in it. And what happens with the sandblasting is a hole will carve conically instead of straight down like a drill bit would carve. So after I took the mask away, I could carve it further, and the deeper I went, the smaller the hole got. And it gave this both physical and illusionary quality of the size of the holes gradating up and down the slope, and trying to bring kind of fluidity into a material that is very resistant to it. So some pieces I cut through the stone. This is red jasper. But I found I missed the slate, and after working with agate, which is about a 7 on a hardness scale of 10, and getting all this diamond abrasive equipment, water-cooled diamond equipment, the slate was just butter to work with, and I found there was a whole new range of things I could do with it. Some pieces I kept very simple, bringing my hand in lightly, just beveling back an edge and backing it. Other pieces I carved in a more intricate way. And I've always worked in series, and it's the way my mind works, but it's also getting ready for an exhibition, having a coherent body of work. It's sort of part of life as a professional maker. So again, the slate has a really nice range. Here I cut the circle with a core drill, and then I discovered that if I soaked the piece in water and hit the center area with a torch, the top layer of slate would pop off, and I would get this rough texture within the smoother field. This is still one of my favorite pieces. I was kind of reversing the framework things I was doing earlier, and I'd always kind of stayed away from setting things from the outside, but I was, again, trying to open things up and making the clothing part of the composition, and this seemed like a good way to do it. So all these pieces are backed in silver, and the mechanisms are on the back, the pin mechanisms. This is another favorite. And at this point, I knew Metalsmith magazine was going to do a feature article on me. And being the son of a New York ad man, if you ever watch Mad Men, my father was like Don Draper or Roger Sterling, the good, the bad, and the ugly of that. And my cousins are all nodding. Yeah. Yeah. I really wanted the cover of the magazine. And I knew the graphic designer and what he tended to do. And what he liked to do was take a color from a photo, drop out that color in a black background, and then use that color as the headline, the Metalsmith magazine. And so when we shot this piece, I shot it as a horizontal like you see, but I also did a shot of it as a vertical. And I thought it would make a really good cover, and it was my favorite piece at the time. And the magazine came out, and it worked out. And he did exactly what I thought he would do. You know, so I mean, the object lesson is make somebody's job easy. You know, they'll follow along, you know, path of least resistance. So I started to get back into the glass and cutting through pieces, and here the cord, which you only see a little bit of, that's actually weed whacker line from the string trimmers for cutting your lawn. And now it's like day glow orange and green, which really pissed me off because it's really ugly. But at the time it was clear and I could frost it, and it was a perfect match for the glass. Here you see a little bit more of it. So one of the things I was looking for is qualities that are unique to jewelry as a medium. And one of those is that it's seen in motion. Also, I was interested in that a brooch lives in a fabric environment or is seen in a fabric environment. And those are qualities I've tried to bring into my work. The niobium that this is over, this is clear glass, so window glass. And the color is the color of the niobium that I anodized. It has a very directional color quality. So as the angle of view of the piece changes, the color intensity would shift. Graduation may be the end of your schooling, but it's just the beginning of your education. So I've been looking to do a workshop, preferably at Haystack Mountain School of Crafts in Deer Isle, Maine, a wonderful place. And every year I'd look at the list of faculty to see if there's somebody I wanted to work with. And one year, David Watkins' name came up, and I don't know, I know some of you know him, but he was running the jewelry program at the Royal College of Art in London, and it is still a big deal in the field. And so I did a 3-week workshop with David at Haystack, which was a great experience. And he gave us an assignment to do something in a grove of trees. And you know, frankly, it was just nice to do something that I didn't have to make a pin back on. And so I did this sort of little bad Andy Goldsworthy knockoff thing in the crease of between these two saplings. And I didn't, you know, I enjoyed it, but I didn't think it would have much of an effect on me. But I got home, and you know, between living on an ancient house on 3 acres of land and spending my life picking up sticks, and the experience at Haystack, I started to carve these stick forms. This one is now on display at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, which was a wonderful thing. So they're softer, a bit more sensual, but the glass at this point kind of took over again. And I've been running with it ever since. So I'm still, at this point, I'm still entirely cold working. I'm using lapidary techniques to carve the glass. These working with the idea that they will shift color with the clothing they're on. The images are kind of textile related, weaving related, with different levels of transparency within the glass depending upon how it's sandblasted. So the little squares become like a little stone setting showing your clothing, and then it's muted through the frosted surfaces. I brought an example of this pin mechanism, and for the jewelers that are here to see, it's something unique that I developed, a variation on a European pin back. But it's better to just see it in person, and then I can explain how it works. So I did a little bit of work with glass rods. These are about an 1/8 inch, 3 millimeter, and they have to be hammer set in place. And my wife says she leaves the house when I do these. Swearing was involved. To grab a thin glass rod firmly enough to keep it permanently in place but to not break it is a challenge, to say the least. Some of the pieces were dichroic glass, so again, as the piece moved, you get different flashes of light in the optics of them. So I kind of ran out of what I could do just entirely cold working. And in 2001, I started to go to the studio of the Corning Museum of Glass, taking 1 or 2 week workshops to build the second set of skills. And this ended up being a fantastic thing. At Corning, at home I was working with a flat lap, a little circular grinding disc, 6 inches in diameter. At Corning, the same wheel was like this. And it was like going from driving an old Chevy to somebody giving me keys to a Maserati. And it was hugely freeing artistically. Things that were taking me days, I was doing in half an hour. And it allowed me to be much less precious with material because the investment of time wasn't so crazy. Also got to work with some blown forms. So this is the bottom of a blown bubble. And started to open up what I could do. These are also from blown forms with layers of color in them. Here I collaborated with a master lamp worker, and I had 3 days in his studio, and he said, "You're the head and I'm the hands." And this is a guy whose family had been blowing glass in Murano for like 500 years. So my challenge to him was, can we make an entirely glass necklace with no metal fittings? So the way this works is the rod passes through the coil to expose the neck opening. You slide it on, and then you slide it back around, and it locks in place. So obviously, Amelia was able to pull this off. I developed another production line. I have some of these. This is black onyx and synthetic ruby, working with a manufacturing company in Eder Oberstein, Germany, the German stone cutting center. And they're inlaid with diamonds. So I applied for a residency at Corning. They give out a month-long, maybe 5 or 6 at the time, month-long residencies. It's an international competition, and I was the first jeweler they ever gave one to. And I think I got it in part because I'd gotten to know them, and there was some personal relationship there, but I also, at least I hope, they liked what I was trying to do. And the proposal was 2 forms of collaboration. One to work with a glass blower to develop new forms, and the other to work with a master engraver. And the engraver I was working with was a man named Max Erlacher. And Max has been engraving glass since he was 13 years old in Austria, and worked for the top glass houses in Austria, then was a master engraver for Suben for 40 years. And at this point, he was well into his 70s. And just, very spry, really funny, and just mad skills. Max tended to do figurative things and floral and representational, and my sensibility is not in that direction. It's more geometric. So this is a rod of Pyrex, of borosilicate glass, and I cut it on a bias, so one end is thicker than the other. So it appears round, but it's really half round. And I had Max engrave 7 identical circles in the back. And the thickness of the glass change caused the distortion in the circle to make them more and more oval, so they gradated down. Here, the skills needed to do this. This is a complex curve in 2 directions, and Max was able to do 2 concentric circles ground out of glass, which is just totally insane. But he did a fantastic job with it. This is all handheld. This is a little grinding wheel that it's crazy. So these are some of the blown forms we did. I had the blower make cylinders in glass and then off them to oval, and then cut sections off of them. And lots of grinding, a lot of shaping. This is blown as a kind of a hollow donut form and then cut in half like you would an English muffin or a bagel. So more blown forms. Working out a mechanism for these to make a pin back and a pendant, and also blown forms. And the diamond inlay in these, it's kind of a complex process. I take the glass after it's completely finished, and these are all completely reground. They don't come out of the blowing like this. These are blown as sort of like a big banana shape, literally about that size. And maybe 1 out of 5, I can find a section that's to my liking. And so I take the glass and carefully mark it with 5 dots with a Sharpie, and then I go to FedEx and send it to Germany, and it comes back like this. So I had an idea. I wanted to make jewelry that heavily magnified the clothing it was on, that acted as a lens. And I didn't know how to do that. And I probably should have talked to a physics professor or an optician or something. But after a period of experimenting, I figured out I needed spheres and cylinders to make that work, to make the optics work. And I got a piece of graphite and started to machine it, and using a ball mill. And it was a simple milling machine, very much like the ones you have here at school, just drilling into the graphite. And then we'd gather hot glass directly from the furnace, press it into the graphite, and lo and behold, it ended up working like a charm. So you can see the magnifying, the different size and diameter lens and different height lenses have different levels of magnification. All right, so this is a milling machine at the University of Wisconsin, which they let me have some access to. And here I'm just doing this for the camera, but you can see other shapes that I've milled into the graphite. And it's graphite about 1 inch thick, and it works beautifully for glass casting. Good, okay. So the graphite mold and pieces that I started to pull out of it. So these come out of the mold on a pad of glass about this big and about that thick, and I have to cut and grind off all the extra glass. The pieces I want are the high points on this hunk of glass. But the magnifying worked really well. And I also found that sandblasted, I like them just as much or more. It doesn't show very well in this, but here they have kind of a glow to them. The optics of the glass just gathers light, and it's almost like they're internally lit. Perhaps the bitchiest thing I've ever made. So this is a huge chunk of glass and a very delicate thing that I'm trying to take out of it. But it worked out okay. So the next step was using computer-aided design and computer-controlled machining. And a friend at Kendall School of Art in Michigan and I made an arrangement. I spent a week at the school, half the time with the students doing critiques and lectures and demos, and half the time with the faculty playing with their really cool high-tech toys. And see if this one will run. Yay, good. All right, so this isn't one of my pieces. I stole this off of YouTube, but this is computer-controlled machining of a graphite block for industry. And when it went away, it went up, it automatically changed to a smaller tool bit, and now is going more slowly as the piece is further and further refined. And it'll go up one more time, I think. So the further it goes, the slower it goes, and we can skip that. So this just blew the doors off of what I could do form-wise. And I started with these water-inspired pieces. I think living on the lakes in Wisconsin kind of soaked into my brain. And I've found a lot I can do with this process. And it basically gives me the freedom of form of CAD, and but in a material I like. The rapid prototyping materials I find kind of dull and lifeless, although I've kind of warmed to them over time. But here I can get that freedom of form, but in a material that I want in the glass. So I purposely make the molds oversized so I can cut different shapes out of the same mold. There's a lot of time and effort and often expense in the molds. These are all cold worked. These aren't molded. And more blown forms, working with another blower. And also cut from blown forms. So the next step was to find a local machine shop, and these people are about 20 miles from where I live, and business was slow, and they were willing to take on doing some graphite. Most machine shops won't touch graphite. The dust is not good, and it gets into machine windings and engines, and it can really mess things up. But they were willing to do it. And here they're using this $250,000 milling center, and they're machining a piece of aluminum. So it's sort of the next technical step in what's possible. They were nice enough to do this with their door open so I could film it. It took their guys 7 hours to clean this $250,000 milling center when my molds were done. And the next time I called, they didn't return my call. But they did beautiful work. Really nice machining, just fantastic. So here's the CAD rendering and the mold and then pieces that came out of it. And the same here. So I did a little bit of work with two-part molds. The one limitation of the open face molds is it needs a flat back. So with a two-part mold, I was able to get away from that. And this is a hot shop session. So I'm working in a hot shop in Madison. The gaffer is a woman named Shayna Leib, who's a friend, and she's already gathered one bit of glass on the rod called a punty, and she's going in for another gather to get enough mass for my molding. She's going to go to the glory hole, heat the glass further, and then I'm over here, and I made this press. I bought a arbor press for $50 from Harbor Freight, cut it apart, kind of customized it so it would hold my two-part molds. The open face molds I just compress with a steel paddle. These, they have to be perfectly indexed. So in a second, she'll go from there to the mold and drip it in. And then the two parts come down. So from the mold, we always fire polish the pieces. So next, she'll go in with a small torch, and that smooths the glass. And the more work we can do with a torch, and that means the less grinding I have to do. And when it's a recessed space like this, it would be particularly problematic to grind. So she's going with a small torch. I'll come in with a big one next and even the heat out, and then we'll put it in the annealer, and it'll cool overnight. So this is a better look at what's going on with the glass. So this isn't slow motion. This is real time. And it's just like this glowing red honey at about 2,000 degrees. So it's another two-part mold. And I love the look of the graphite. At some point, I want to make some work out of it. It's a really beautiful material, just a rich, dark gray. And whenever I go up to Corning to take a class, I get access to a new process or a new material. So these are fused. And I developed a new production line based on the one-of-a-kind work again of earrings. Worked with a hydraulic press to make the model. Also did a residency in Austria and got access to a water jet cutter that cut this one out. And I think my aesthetic sort of permeates through. This should start automatically. All right. So this is a 3D printer in glass. And it's a bin of recycled glass powder and an inkjet head dispensing an organic glue. And it builds the piece up layer by layer. And in the beginning, it starts to look like footprints in the snow. The glass is a window glass. It's a recycled window glass. So next, he's taking it into an oven to cure it, to set the glue a bit more. After that's done, he's going to submerge it in a high-tech sand after cleaning it all off. In a high-tech sand and fire it, and the glue burns off and the glass fuses together and it maintains its shape, kind of miraculously, I think. So I'll let him do his cleaning. All the extra powder, which acts as a support for the glass, is recycled and reused, and again. So at this point, it's a very delicate thing. These are, I think it's a wedding picture or something, bride and groom and bride in there. That they use for so this is the sand they're going to use to act as a support, and then they'll fire it. And they need a support structure that'll give some support, but is also flexible. These pieces shrink about 10% in the firing. If they were in something rigid, they'd all crack. So these are not mine. These are some examples from their video of what other people have done. And unfortunately, they've stopped doing this. There just wasn't enough demand for the process, which is too bad because it really did some pretty things. So these are pieces I did with that, inspired by Greek columns, kind of distorting Greek column forms. And here I printed a model in plastic and then did a mold and did lost wax casting for the glass. These are some of my favorite recent things. And I'm still working with blown forms. Some of these are here. These are cut from a vase form about this size, and I cut a section out and then refine the form. And I think of them as abstractions of flower petals. So the most recent stuff, I've moved to organic forms and organic materials, shells and cabbage leaves. And I had this idea for pieces inspired by food for more than 5 years. And I kept pushing it aside, saying this is the dumbest idea I've ever thought of, and totally silly and frivolous, and it just would not leave me alone. And the only way to get it to leave me alone is to make something and see if, which voice in my head is right. So I cast a celery, literally doing lost celery casting in the kiln. And it's like, I'm not sure about this, but I think I kind of like it. And then I wore it, and it got some great reactions. And I thought, all right, I'm gonna run with it. So working with asparagus, I have the blue one on as well. There's some of the celery. And I was like, I could be wrong, but I think they're kind of sexy. So this is acorn squash, so the top of the squash, and apples. And these are set over niobium, and they'll work as a brooch or a pendant as well, with gold leaves and stems. So this is kind of the process. This is an orange and an apple. I took a rubber mold of those, and then I made a rubber positive of the apple, and then I made a plaster mold of the rubber positive, and then we cast glass into it in a kiln. So Homer says wearing vegetables is better than donuts. I had this crazy idea to make a piece that was a stick of butter, and I was invited to be in a butterfly exhibit in Spain, and the silly punster in me came out, so I made my butterfly brooch. And I have a friend that makes these wonderful pearls with laser engraved flies on them, so she was able to sell me one of those. That's my photographer. So I was awarded a 2-week residency at a glass factory in Portland, Oregon, with the idea of making some cast glass sculpture. So this piece is about like this. It's a 3-inch thick block of MDF that we machined in the same way as we did the smaller graphite molds. So after the machining, I had to do hours and hours of hand sanding and then lacquer this. So the mold rubber would come off of it properly. So I got this positive, and I shipped those out, took those out to Oregon with me, to the Ouroboros glass factory, set a border around it, cast plaster into that, and then I'm going to cast glass into the plaster. These were about 70 or 80 pounds of plaster, these things. So it was probably the hardest physical work I've ever done, just lifting and moving these things. So here the kiln is loaded. This kiln is maybe about here to the wall, massive. I was able to get 6 pieces in it. So here filled with chunks of glass, and then after the casting, they were in the annealer for about 13 days. The thicker the glass, the longer it has to anneal. And then these are photos of the pieces that came out. So my wife and I used to live in Rhode Island. We owned the oldest house in the state, built in 1677. The National Historic Registry lists the architecture type as post-medieval. You know? I'd never heard of that. Not one of your larger schools of architecture. It's not postmodern, it's post-medieval. So, you know, it was there 100 years at the time of the American Revolution. It's 57 years after the Pilgrims landed, this thing was built. And it was a wonderful place to be that I still love. But my wife went back to school in her mid-40s. She says MFA stands for Mid-40s Adventure. And she got a master's at the Iowa Writers Workshop and is now a professor at the University of Wisconsin and has a novel that came out, a second novel that came out a couple months ago, which I will shamelessly plug. So this is where we're living now. We live in the University Arboretum, which is a large forested tree research facility for the school that has a small enclave of houses in the middle of it. And it feels like you're 20 miles out in the country, but my wife is maybe 7 minutes from school. So the house and this structure is my studio. This is my morning commute. And this is inside the studio. So half of it is set up for glass, cold working glass, grinding. This is a flat lap and lapidary equipment. And the other half is set up for goldsmithing. I want to point out this. It's not a great picture of it. This is my IKEA soldering cabinet. I went to IKEA, bought an appliance garage that had a great aluminum roll top front. Why your appliances need a garage, I'm not entirely sure, but it was a perfect solution. I attached a ventilation system to the back of it and sunk my pickle pot down into the table, and it works like a dream. The obligatory, very cute dog shot, Josie. This piece is called Necklace for an Insecure Man. I was president of the Society of North American Goldsmiths, and they did a fashion show for the first time. They call it an exhibition in motion. And while I took the job very seriously, I don't take titles very seriously, so I decided to have some fun with it and do this piece. And you had to model it yourself, unfortunately. But my sentiment here, the world is shaped by the activists, those that take the time to be involved to do the work. So whether you're in this field or something other, I encourage you to be involved and help make things better. My photographer and my shameless plug of my wife's book.